The concept of peak experiences becomes an even more powerful tool for understanding the vast range of human experience when we extrapolate on the last idea presented. Your vertical or structural center of gravity determines your interpretation of every peak experience. This interplay of states and stages is best encapsulated in a diagram such as this. Called the Wilber-Combs Lattice, named after Allan Combs and Ken Wilber, who first spotted these important distinctions. As you can see, on the vertical axis, we have the altitude spectrum, and across the top, we have 4 states: gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual. Then, in the center, each sphere represents a substantively different peak experience. Yes, you're onto the wild implications here. When we take the structural interpretations into consideration, the 4 peak experiences we just spoke about transform into a vast territory of 48 distinctly interpreted peak experiences. Just to be clear, this is one of several possible variations. You can construct a Wilber-Combs lattice using any configuration of levels. Sometimes it works best with egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric, cosmocentric, or any of the versions of the state spectrum, 3, 4, or 5. The only difference is the amount of detail that's required. Do you need more or less experiences represented? Functionally, any version of the Wilber-Combs lattice is the same. Peak experiences of states are interpreted through structures or levels. We'll come back to the Wilber-Combs lattice in the applications path. For now, we'll look at one classic example which beautifully demonstrates the lattice's true explanatory power. Before we move on, keep in mind that structures are not just responsible for the interpretation of peak experiences. As a matter of fact, they interpret all state experiences from the mundane to the sacred. This is simply because the level of complexity that an individual has developed to determines their depth of understanding of whatever it is that they encounter. Additionally, just as infants do not have access to abstract concepts, structures also determine the depth and type of content available to an individual, whereas states are the space that determine what realm of experience is being revealed. You are fairly developed when it comes to vertical development, right? Your center of gravity is most likely approaching or has already entered integral or second-tier levels of development, right? And you probably had your fair share of peak experiences, probably even non-dual experiences. Have you ever thought that your development influenced the way you made sense of those peak experiences? Consider someone with a much lower center of gravity, say at red. Do you think that they too could have a non-dual peak experience? The answer is a resounding yes. And here's the now classic example. Consider a religious fundamentalist. Doesn't matter which religion. Go ahead and pick your favorite flavor of extreme ideology. After detonating a suicide bomb in a public market, a video surfaces in which they say something like, "Through my act of great service, I now become one with God. May I live in peace eternally." What in the world can make them believe something like that? How could they feel it so deeply and passionately as to justify such extreme actions? They've got to be crazy, right? Well, maybe, but consider this. What if a truly authentic peak experience led them to deeply believe a statement like this? So much so that their actions were not only justified, but were indeed the most appropriate expression. This is where it gets interesting. Their very real peak experience was filtered through an interpretive self-sense that had developed to red. This interpretation then led to the behavioral expression. The peak experience merely provided the deep motivation or ultimate justification, if you will. Even though we can't fully separate these two elements, the state experience and the structural interpretation, we can relate to or work with them differently. First, we must admit that their peak experience was authentic, real, and valid, or at least that this is possible for many fundamentalists, because peak experiences are possible regardless of developmental level. Second, and independently, we can value or rank the action based on this individual's specific interpretation as immoral, egocentric, not compassionate, and ultimately less developmentally complex. Also, it's worth noting that a red center of gravity does not alone lead to suicide bombings. What we actually have is a full psychograph of lines factoring into the interpretation. In a similar sense, nor do non-dual peak experiences necessarily result in violence. In fact, many suicide bombers may just be following orders, not influenced by a profound state experience at all. In the end, let your takeaway be the need, or possibly even the requirement, to up-level the complexity with which you come to understand or make sense of other people's actions, motivations, and experiences. And of course, extend the same consideration to your own actions and experiences. This, almost singularly, is the power and promise of the integral approach in action. In summary, here's the most important point. Structures determine the content of all state experiences, and states determine what realms of experience are available. Another way to put this is, states are the containers, and structures determine content and interpretation. Earlier, we said the integral approach worked with natural states in two manners. First was as realms of experience available to each of us. The second way it works with natural states is as